a legend at the piano, a host in tears, and somewhere in the audience, a woman living the final months of her life. That night, The Tonight Show didn't turn into entertainment. It turned into a farewell. Paul McCartney's fingers froze above the keys. The melody of Let It Be hung suspended in the air, incomplete, broken. Jimmy Fallon stood motionless near his desk, his signature smile nowhere to be found. And in the third row, a 78-year-old woman named Margaret held a photograph against her chest, trembling. No one in that studio knew what was about to happen. No one watching at home could have predicted it. But in the next few minutes, television history would be made. Not with comedy. Not with music. But with something far more rare, raw, unscripted humanity. But how did we get here? What brought these three strangers together in one of the most emotional moments ever broadcast on late-night television? To understand that, we need to go back to the beginning. Margaret Thompson had never been to New York City. For 78 years, she lived in a small town in Ohio, raised 4 children, buried a husband, and kept a secret that only her eldest daughter knew. In 1964, when she was 19 years old, Margaret attended the very first Beatles concert in America. It was the night that changed her life. Not because of the screaming fans or the hysteria, but because of a song that hadn't even been written yet. 3 years later, her husband Robert was deployed to Vietnam. Before he left, Margaret gave him a single gift, a vinyl record of Let It Be, and a handwritten note that said, "Whenever you hear this song, know that I'm waiting." Robert never came home. For 56 years, Margaret played that song every single night before bed. She never remarried. She never stopped waiting. And now, diagnosed with terminal cancer and given only months to live, she had one final wish. Not to meet a celebrity. Not to be on television. Simply to hear Let It Be performed live, one last time, before she joined her husband. Her daughter wrote a letter to The Tonight Show. She didn't expect a response. She certainly didn't expect what happened next. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The Tonight Show production team receives thousands of letters every week. Stories of triumph, tragedy, hope, and heartbreak flood the mailroom daily. Most are read, appreciated, and filed away. But when producer Sarah Chin opened Margaret's letter, she stopped breathing for a moment. Then she walked directly into Jimmy Fallon's office. Jimmy read the letter twice. Then he made a phone call that would change everything. "Paul," he said, "I need to ask you something. And I need you to say yes." What Jimmy Fallon didn't tell his production team, what he didn't tell his writers, what he kept secret from everyone except Paul McCartney himself, was the plan he had been forming since the moment he finished reading Margaret's letter. The night of the taping arrived. Margaret sat in the third row, flanked by her daughter and 2 grandchildren. She had no idea that anything unusual was planned. As far as she knew, she had simply won tickets through a radio contest her daughter had secretly arranged. She wore her best dress, the same navy blue she had worn to Robert's memorial service decades ago. And tucked inside her purse was the original photograph from 1964, a young Margaret, barely visible in the crowd, reaching toward a stage where 4 boys from Liverpool were changing the world. Behind the scenes, Fallon made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. He threw away the script. He canceled the planned comedy segment. And he told his stage manager 5 words that sent shockwaves through the control room. "Tonight we do something different." The show began normally. Jimmy delivered his monologue with the usual energy. He bantered with the Roots. He introduced his first guest, a young actress promoting a summer blockbuster. Everything seemed routine. But those who knew Jimmy well noticed something different in his eyes. A focus. A wait. As if he was waiting for something. Then came the moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jimmy announced, his voice dropping slightly, "we have a very special musical guest tonight. Someone who needs no introduction. Someone whose music has defined generations. Please welcome Sir Paul McCartney. The audience erupted. Paul walked out, waving, smiling, and took his seat at the grand piano that had been wheeled onto the stage. The cheers slowly faded. The lights dimmed. And Paul leaned into the microphone. "I'd like to play something for you tonight," he said softly. "A song that means a lot to me. And I recently learned it means even more to someone sitting in this audience." Margaret's heart stopped. Her daughter squeezed her hand. Paul's fingers touched the keys. The opening notes of "Let It Be" filled the studio. And for a moment, everything was perfect. The melody soared. The audience swayed. Margaret closed her eyes, transported back 60 years to a living room where a young soldier held her in his arms and promised to come home. Then Paul looked up. His eyes scanned the audience. And they found her. He saw the photograph she was clutching. He saw the tears streaming down her face. He saw a 78-year-old woman who had waited her entire life for this moment. And something inside him shifted. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. Paul McCartney stopped playing. The music died mid-phrase. The audience gasped. Jimmy Fallon stepped forward, confusion flickering across his face. But Paul simply stood up from the piano, stepped off the stage, and walked directly into the audience. 200 people sat in stunned silence as one of the most famous musicians in history navigated between the rows of seats. Cameras scrambled to follow him. The control room erupted in chaos. This wasn't planned. This wasn't in the script. This was something else entirely. Paul stopped in front of Margaret. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Margaret looked up at him, her weathered hands still holding the photograph, her eyes wide with disbelief. Paul looked down at her, and those who were close enough swore they saw tears forming in his eyes. "May I see that?" he asked gently, gesturing to the photograph. Margaret's hands trembled as she handed it over. Paul studied the image. The young girl in the crowd, reaching toward a stage where he had stood 60 years ago, full of dreams and music and possibility. "You were there," he whispered. "You were there at the beginning." Margaret nodded, unable to speak. Paul handed the photograph back. Then he did something that broke every rule of television, every protocol of celebrity, every barrier between performer and audience. He knelt down beside her chair, took her hand in his, and said, "Tell me about him. Tell me about Robert." The studio fell absolutely silent. And Margaret, for the first time in 56 years, told her story out loud. She told Paul about the record she gave Robert before he shipped out. About the promise she made. About the night she learned he wasn't coming home. About the decades of playing "Let It Be" before bed, talking to a man who could no longer answer. Jimmy Fallon stood frozen near his desk. The cameras captured everything. The audience wept openly. And when Margaret finished speaking, Paul McCartney did something no one expected. He began to sing. Not from the stage. Not with a microphone. Not with any accompaniment. Just his voice, soft and intimate, singing "Let It Be," directly to a widow who had waited a lifetime to hear it. "When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me, speaking words of wisdom, let it be." Jimmy Fallon broke. The man who had spent 20 years making America laugh finally let America see him cry. He walked over to where Paul knelt beside Margaret, and he knelt too. The host of The Tonight Show, in his expensive suit, on the floor of his own studio, holding the hand of a woman he had never met but would never forget. The audience rose to their feet. Not applauding. Not cheering. Just standing, bearing witness to something sacred. The Roots, unprompted, began to softly play along from their platform. Questlove's drums whispered beneath Paul's voice. The saxophone breathed a gentle harmony. And Margaret, surrounded by music and love and strangers who had become family, finally let go. She wept for Robert. She wept for the years. She wept for the girl who had once reached toward a stage in 1964, not knowing that 60 years later, the stage would reach back. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. When the song ended, Paul helped Margaret to her feet. Jimmy embraced her. The audience's applause finally broke free, thundering through the studio with an emotion that transcended entertainment. This wasn't a television moment. This was a human moment. But Jimmy Fallon wasn't finished. He turned to his desk and picked up an envelope that had been sitting there all night, unseen by the cameras. He walked back to Margaret and handed it to her. "This is for you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Open it." Margaret's trembling fingers broke the seal. Inside was a letter on official stationery. A letter from the Department of Defense. A letter that had taken Jimmy Fallon's team 3 weeks to obtain. It was Robert's final letter home. The one that had been lost in military bureaucracy for 56 years. The one Margaret never knew existed. "My dearest Margaret," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back to you. But I need you to know something." Margaret couldn't continue reading. Her daughter took the letter and finished it aloud, her voice breaking with every word. "Every night I play our song. And every night I see your face. Whatever happens tomorrow, I need you to know, you were my let it be. You were my moment of peace in all this chaos. And if there's a heaven, I'll be there, waiting for you. The way you waited for me." The studio dissolved into tears. Jimmy Fallon buried his face in his hands. Paul McCartney stood with his arm around Margaret, a living bridge between her past and her present. And somewhere, perhaps, Robert Thompson finally got to see his wife hear the words he never got to deliver. That night changed everything. Jimmy Fallon has spoken about it in interviews since. He calls it, "The night I remembered why I do this. Not for the ratings. Not for the fame. But for the moments when television stops being television and becomes something more." Margaret Thompson passed away 4 months later, surrounded by her family, with Robert's letter in her hands and "Let It Be" playing softly in the background. But before she died, she sent Jimmy Fallon one final gift, the original photograph from 1964, signed on the back with a simple message. "Thank you for giving me my goodbye." That photograph now hangs in Jimmy Fallon's office. Not on the wall with the celebrity photos and award nominations, but on his desk, where he sees it every day. A reminder that behind every face in his audience, there is a story. A love. A loss. A lifetime. Paul McCartney, when asked about that night, said only this: "Some songs you write for the world. And some songs you discover were written for one person all along. That night, I finally understood who Let It Be was really for." The Tonight Show has hosted presidents and pop stars, comedians and kings. But ask anyone who was there that night, and they'll tell you, nothing has ever come close. Because for one brief moment, the barriers fell. The scripts disappeared. And 3 strangers, a legend, a host, and a widow, reminded the world what it means to be human. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. Letters poured into The Tonight Show by the thousands. Not fan mail. Not requests for tickets. But stories. Thousands upon thousands of stories from people across America who had their own Margaret. Their own Robert. Their own song that carried the weight of a lifetime. A veteran from Texas wrote about hearing "Let It Be" in a hospital in Saigon, wondering if he would ever see his wife again. A grandmother from Florida shared how she danced to that song at her wedding in 1969, and again at her husband's funeral 40 years later. A young soldier stationed overseas wrote that he watched the clip 17 times, and finally called his mother for the first time in 2 years. Jimmy Fallon read every single letter. Every one. His staff said he was different after that night. Quieter in some ways. More present. He started a tradition that continues to this day. Before every show, he walks through the audience. Not waving. Not performing. Just looking. Making eye contact. Remembering that every seat holds a story he will never fully know. The photograph Margaret gave him became more than a memento. It became a compass. Whenever the pressure of ratings or the chaos of production threatened to overwhelm him, Jimmy would look at that image of a 19-year-old girl reaching toward a stage, and remember why he started doing this in the first place. Not for the applause. Not for the fame. But for the chance, however rare, to be part of something that matters. Some moments are made for television. And some moments simply happen, whether the cameras are rolling or not. That night, the cameras just happened to be there. And we are all better for it.